right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our chat today. My name is Jennifer Sugden. I'm the Acting Associate Registrar of Admissions and Recruitment. And with me, I have Dr. Tara Stehelin, who I'm sure that's why most of you are here, is to hear all about the new ornithology research that she's been doing. And before we get to that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the science programs that we have here at the university. And yeah, we'll hop right in. Okay. So just on this first slide is some contact information. I will have it up at the end as well with more information on how to reach us if you do have questions after this presentation. Sorry, there we go. Okay. So the first program that I wanted to briefly touch on, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on the programs, otherwise we'll be here for a full hour with me just talking science programs, and we want to hear Tara. So briefly, Earth Sciences is a 2-year program that we have here at the university, and it's a fantastic program if you're interested in getting out and getting into environmental monitoring, water resources, mineral exploration, things like that. There's lots of in-lab work as well as being out in the field and experience. It is the first 2 years of a Bachelor of Science degree in geoscience, and it is also set up to transfer to several institutions, but it has a block transfer set up so that you can go right into years 3 and 4 at the University of Vancouver Island, which is really cool because you get to work in 2 really differently dramatic sort of geoscience areas. So you get to start up here in the north and then transfer down there and get to see a whole different world of geosciences and things like that. So phenomenal program, highly encourage you to check it out. I do have the information link, so check out yukonu.ca/science for any of the programs that I'm talking about today. And feel free to reach out to us to ask questions because we would love to tell you more about what we have and talk to you about options and career opportunities and what it means to study at UConn in these programs. If at any point you do have questions, please feel free to pop them into the chat. Otherwise, there will be an opportunity at this end of this presentation to ask questions to both myself and to Tara. So moving on, we have a Diploma of Northern Science as well as a Diploma of Northern Science with a focus on Environmental and Conservation Sciences stream. So I'm going to talk about the 2 of them together because they're a similar program, just with slight differences just to make the streamlining a little bit easier if you're looking at going into the 4-year degree program, which I will talk more about afterwards. This program, again, awesome focus on science in the north. We are so fortunate up here with the opportunities that we have for research, for getting out into the fields, for getting into these positions where a lot of people don't have the opportunities that we do to get out on the land and do these smaller experiential courses and things like that. These programs, the Northern Science program, is designed to get you out into the field. It's designed to get you professional work in the sciences, so potentially working in labs if that's what your passions are, or if you're interested in becoming a field technician or biologist, things like that. These are all opportunities that you can start with in these Northern Science programs and either move straight into those fields after your diploma or continue on to a 4-year degree. The programs are transferable, and the majority of coursework you're going to have no problem transferring elsewhere if you want to continue to pursue a degree in other sciences, moving up into the higher areas. So as I said, the biggest difference between the 2 of these, even though they're very, very similar, is just that the ENCS stream, Environmental and Conservation Sciences stream, is specifically focused to make you sure that you transition straight into years 3 and 4 of the University of Alberta's Bachelor of Science program, which is run all up here at Yukon University. And I will talk more about that as we continue on. Some of the big benefits of our science programs are that we have much smaller class sizes, fantastic research opportunities and opportunities to work with your faculty and things like that to get your name out there and get on some really cool projects, as well as just have an opportunity to really get the supports that you need to be successful. So again, check out yukonu.ca/science. Or as I said at the end, we will have our contact information up and you can feel free to reach out with more questions. We're happy to help out. Renewable Resource Management is another program that you could move into the 4-year degree with. You'd definitely want to work with your advisor on that, but this takes more of a focus on the natural, both living and non-living world. So it is more focused towards the biology side of things, forestry, those types of areas. The Northern Sciences, you can have a bit more of a focus towards chemistry and mathematics if that is your excitement. Some of the cool things that you can do in some of these science programs is that along with your academic courses where you get to do your general science courses, but as well focus a little bit more on some of what your particular interests are, is that you get some of these non-credit courses. So for example, your winter travel and survival courses, wilderness first aid, firearm safety, things like that. Again, the courses are all transferable, and there's lots of careers that you can go into in the sciences. It's a really cool field. It's got lots of opportunities and so many different ways that it can go. And with climate change and with the way the world is going, science is one of those things that we know is growing too. And there's more and more need for people to be in these fields, providing this research and finding ways to help sustain what we have. Again, for the information, yukonu.ca/science, have a look. So our Northern Environmental and Conservation Sciences program is really cool. It is a partnership with the University of Alberta. All 4 years are done here at Yukon University, but the degree comes from both U of A and Yukon University. So it's a dual credential. It's really cool. As I said, the first 2 years you can start in the Northern Science stream or in Renewable Resources, and years 3 and 4 you do at the university, although you are also a U of A student at that time. There are opportunities if you're really keen to go down and maybe get out of the Yukon for a semester and do a few classes down at U of A. That is an opportunity, and vice versa. We get the students from U of A coming up here to do some of the coursework that can only be offered up here. So really cool opportunity. Highly recommend that you check it out. You've heard this, but check out yukonu.ca/science. Yeah, and ask us lots of questions. And last, I'm going to talk a little bit about just the general science certificate. It's your first year science courses, sort of opens the door if you're thinking of going into sciences, but not totally sure in what direction of science you want to go in. It gives you lots of opportunities to try out some of those biology courses, chemistry courses, physics, all those different areas, to mathematics to check out and things like that. So great first year course. Again, the classes are transferable. So if you're thinking you might want to go elsewhere, or if you're thinking you want to stay here, but you're not totally sure which direction of science you want to go in, great first step to get started. So that is really quickly, in a nutshell, some of our science programs that we have here at Yukon University. This is the contact information. I'm going to leave this up for just a minute here. Do reach out to us. Let us know if you have questions. We're excited to help and hopefully help you get started on your career in sciences. I'll pull this up again at the end when we are giving you opportunities to ask more questions. But in the meantime, I'm going to pass it over to Tara and let her introduce herself and talk what we're really all here to see and learn about, which is the ornithology. Over to you, Tara.
Hi, I'm just trying to share my screen. You guys can see that okay?
We're good.
Is my screen, my slides are up okay?
Yeah.
Okay, hi. Thanks, Jen. I'm Tara Stehelin. Yeah, I'm a biology instructor at Yukon U. And I'm also the coordinator of the Renewable Resources Management Program. So I can answer some questions about that if you have those later. But I was asked to talk a bit about some ornithological research that I've been conducting. So this is just an example of research being done at Yukon U. There's other instructors and faculty and folks in the research center that are conducting research as well. Some of them also on ornithology. So this is really just an example. Jen referred to it as new research. It's not all that new. I've been conducting the project that I want to talk about over the past 7 or 8 years. So I suppose relatively new, with new branches kind of coming off of it. So there's certainly opportunities for students to get involved at various junctures in this research and kind of offshoots and ongoing monitoring and things like that. But it's really just an example. It's not the only ornithology research being conducted at our university. So this research focuses on bird species, several of the 300 bird species that utilize the boreal forest to breed, representing in our boreal forest in North America, well over 1 billion individual birds utilize our northern boreal forest to breed. So it's a very important region. One of the least fragmented and disturbed biomes in the world is boreal forest. Also has incredible capability to sequester carbon and things like that. So very important for research around, land use change and climate and supporting breeding habitat for things like birds. And this research, this project I did in collaboration with University of Alberta. So Yukon University, University of Alberta, and in particular, the Boreal Avian Modeling Project, which is an international research collaborative group. It's international, but based at University of Alberta. So some of the main reasons for undertaking this research, are declining biodiversity globally, including birds. Recent estimates are somewhere around 1 in 4 birds are now gone from North America since about 1970 because of a multitude of factors like land use change and agricultural intensification, deforestation, and climate change and other factors. So studying the impacts of climate change and some of these other, contributing factors are essential to understanding the disappearance of, populations and declining trends and things like that. And also just the importance of the boreal forest to provide breeding habit for, 300 species of birds and various other taxonomic groups as well. And also climate change. So climate change in North America is 2 to 4 times the global average, especially in northern regions in northern Canada and Alaska. In some places it's 4 times the global average. So understanding how this will impact species that live in the north is absolutely essential and best conducted here where climate change is occurring at such a rapid pace. So for this part of the project, I focused in on 2 species of boreal breeding birds that are insectivorous. So they rely on flying insects to find food, and all birds in this category are declining in North America. All aerial insectivores are declining. So these 2 species are no exception. So long-term trends since about 1970 show very dramatic declines. For both of these species, it's around 2.6% per year that they're declining by. So these are pretty dramatic declines. They're regionally specific, so they're not declining in the exact same, rate in every region. But some of those declines are particularly pronounced in the north and the west, regions of the north and the west. This is just a video. You can't hear the sound. So at the end, maybe I have to switch microphones. If you want to hear the sound later, I could play it again at the end. So this is just showing from, our recent report, Canada's Changing Climate Report from 2019, just the observed changes in annual temperature. in Canada. So, you can see in northern regions how dramatic these temperature changes are, in particular in the winter and the spring, which has a lot of implications for birds that are migrating and are taking advantage of spring conditions to start breeding and then feeding young, and if conditions are already much warmer and snow melt has occurred much sooner, it's going to impact their ability to breed and to be as successful, especially if they're migrating from far distances where they may not be receiving cues from that far away that the environment and the ecosystem has changed. So the temperature change where they're migrating from might not be as evident. And so they can't necessarily time migration to come early and take advantage of the earlier spring that we're seeing in northern regions. So it's a very rapid pace of climate change. So understanding the potential impacts on our species that breed here is very important. So this exposes birds to potentially, novel climate conditions and changing community dynamics. So spring might be well underway by the time they arrive here. So there might be different insects available than previously, or different, age classes of insects, or insects might have already peaked well before they even started breeding. So it's just the community dynamics are altered by this changing temperature. And this is just, I could play that one at the end. This is another video of a western wood pewee. So both of the species that I've been focusing on most recently are long distance migrants. So they migrate, 9,000 to 10,000 kilometers, the longest migratory route of any North American breeding bird that's in this huge family that we sometimes call the flycatchers, all the birds that, rely on flying insects. So it's a very long migratory route. So it exposes them to potentially multiple stressors on this long route. So, not just climate change, but also changes to land use, agricultural intensification, this new widespread reliance on, a relatively new class of pesticides called the neonicotinoids, particularly as they pass through Central America and through the United States, in their month-long migration to reach the breeding grounds. So they're exposed to all these different things. And then when they arrive to the breeding grounds in northern North America, conditions might have changed because spring is occurring at a different time. And insects might already be well underway, spring is underway, whereas a couple hundred years ago, before recent climate change started to occur, conditions were different. There would have been peaks of insects timed with when they were breeding. Come on, I lost my cursor. There we go. So one of the techniques that I've been using a lot, so I have a combination of field study and community dynamics investigation combined with species distribution modeling. So species distribution modeling is this technique that associates bird data. So if you're lucky enough to have abundance data, sometimes it's just presence, absence data, or if you're lucky enough to have access to it, abundance data, and associates that with various environmental predictors. So that could be climate, land cover, forest type, topography. It could potentially be, many layers of predictors that can be used to then predict probabilities of occurrence. So to then predict where, that species is likely to be found. So relative abundance, distribution. And then we can also include layers that are predictive. So predictive climate change layers, and get predictions of where they might be, under future climate scenarios. So that's a technique that I've been using a lot in conjunction with the Boreal Avian Modeling Project, because this is a very collaborative approach. It includes, information from all sorts of different specialists. So climate scientists, other ecologists, GIS specialists, to include all these different sources of information to then come up with probabilities of occurrence, and predictions of where, species might be found under different scenarios. So species distribution modeling it's a whole suite of modeling techniques. So this is one of the the techniques that I use to try to predict where these species might be under future climate change, and also presence abundance, or present abundance and things like that, to ultimately, determine whether, uh, you know, there's the potential to provide some refugia or some areas where species can kind of quote unquote hide from future climate change or future land use change and maybe survive this period of warming. So there could be potentially lots of covariates predictors that we include. This is a whole suite that I've used for some species that has various climate and land use, topography, and they're all contributing somewhat, but really the biggest contributors are land cover and land use and forest types and things like that. So if certain forest types are present, we can predict the continued presence of certain species of birds. So they rely on forest cover, which, makes a lot of sense. And then we can sort of delve further into some of those categories and ask questions about what type of forests and what type of land cover and what characteristics of the forest are really important. So there's a lot of information that can be gleaned from these huge modeling efforts. We can even look at interactive effects. Don't worry about the specifics. It's just to show you some examples of things you can pull out. Like, abundance, distribution and abundance might be influenced by mixed forest. So mixed forest is really important for an aerial insectivore because there's different, heterogeneity in what's available. So there's this forest structure with multi-ages of trees and open space, which allows them to hunt for insects and things like that, and to hide, and also different structure to provide nesting sites. So heterogeneity is really important, but mixed forest is disappearing with year. So that's why there's this interactive effect between mixed forest predicts abundance, but it depends on the year, because mixed forest is one of the types of forests that's, disappearing with year. So just some examples of things, you can pull out all kinds of different interactive effects. Some of the other things that we look at, we can pull out from all those, modeling, those general results. We can dive into particular forest structure that might predict higher abundance. And we're finding that relative to availability, certain types of forest habitat are preferred, or that's what the data indicate, because abundance is much higher relative to what's available. So something like mixed open forest might not be highly available, but when it's available, species tend to be there because it's preferred. It provides that heterogeneity. It provides dead trees to forage from. Those snags are really important. But it also has live trees for nesting areas, an open area for movement. These birds are really active flyers, and they're diving to catch insects, so they need an open structure. But they also need live trees. They need that heterogeneity. So mixed forest is really important. Riparian habitats are incredibly important. That means anywhere where there's fresh water, like creeks and wetlands and things like that, because usually that provides abundant insects. And open areas like tundra and old burns, so over 10-year-old burns, are really important because they provide snags for foraging from, but also a mixture of some live trees for nest site provision. So this complexity is really important. These forests that have multi-ages and spaces and, some wetlands and ponds nearby are really important to support abundance of these birds and other birds as well. Biodiversity in general is supported by those kinds of conditions. So that's just to show you some of the things we can pull out. Of course, I'm not going to show you all the results from some of these things. Other things, so we can project our results onto maps to see what areas, support relative high abundances, and how that changes over time. So there's a lot of information on one map here. This is the baseline, the first one, so the center year, these are 30-year increments. The center year is 1995. So a lot of higher abundance in the darker green. Those are regions that could potentially support high abundance of the species. And then it changes as we go into the future, depending on whether we assume a high emission scenario or a relatively low one. This is a relatively high emission scenario. So it still is probably supporting, some abundance. But if you look at the differences, red on the blue projection, the red area shows where areas have been lost. So those areas are no longer appropriate, looking ahead to this future scenario to support that species because it's just too hot and dry. So central Alaska, parts of central Yukon, are just too hot and dry to support a bird species that eats insects anymore going into the future. So there's a lot of information we can get from these models. There's other things too. You can ask so many questions and try to provide data to, answer them. So overall, we're seeing, major changes in distribution and abundance and range size and fragmentation of range as we look into future projections. One of the big questions I had is, can the boreal forest provide a place to hide? Like, can species, we call that a refugia? Can species maybe hide from these warming conditions and drying conditions? And the answer to that is sort of in some places. So this projection is just another way of looking at it. Yellow is areas that are going to be lost. They will not provide refugia. It's just too hot, too dry to, mostly to support abundant insects. But the dark blue areas are areas where potentially, this species could persist under future climate change conditions. But you'll notice that they're kind of very scattered and fragmented. So there's a lot of questions as to whether they're connected enough, whether birds will be able to breed appropriately and maintain genetic variation and all those things. And an overall decline in abundance is usually predicted for most species because appropriate areas where they could exist are getting smaller. They're moving farther north and usually contracting or fragmenting. But the answer is, there are some areas that could provide refugia, but it's pretty limited as we move into future climate change scenarios. And then looking at some more, locally based parts of this research. So looking at community and population ecology. So I set out to investigate, impacts of climate change at the community level and even the individual level. So tracking breeding success locally, collecting insects to get an idea for what kind of food is available for birds. So, and looking at phenology was just a fancy way of saying timing. Like, when are they breeding and does it still coincide with when there's an insect peak? And how is that changing with year? And what insect species do they prefer? What are they feeding to their young? Because we didn't even know that when we started this project. So examining insects and birds, so try to look at the interplay between them and look at the timing between them. So some of the, sorry, that's sensitive. Some of the field methods examples, so aerial insect sampling we do. We also look at insects by walking transects to get an idea of the larger insects, because the larger insects don't go into the traps. So to get an idea of abundance and diversity of insects, so food available for the birds. And then from the bird perspective, looking at monitoring of breeding phenology and breeding success, finding nests, which is exceedingly difficult for these species. They're really good at hiding their nests. And then feeding observations at some of those nests. And then also looking at, vegetation, what vegetation characteristics might be important at nesting sites and in these territories. And also tracking migratory patterns, which is kind of a separate thing, but something I'm also very interested in. So to track, breeding success, we use a combination of game cameras, direct observation with spotting scopes and binoculars, mounted cameras, or just plain old sounds. If we can't see into the nest and it's too high up to get a camera into, then, just plain old understanding of behavior and sounds, and trying to conduct this in a way that, is the least invasive possible. So because we don't want to disturb birds that are breeding, especially species that are quite rare, like the olive-sided flycatcher is quite rare. And western wood pewee is, they're both dramatically declining. So we want to be really careful that we don't disturb breeding, but still collect as much information as we can. So these are just some images from a game camera. This shows a female coming in to feed young. My cursor's lost again. A female coming in to feed young at the nest. So we can get an idea of just behavior and is it the male or the female doing the feeding, and try to get ideas of what she's feeding her young. Sometimes it's hard to see because the insect material, she catches, large insects, beetles or dragonflies or something, and then she'll actually smash them all up. And the male will as well, against a tree trunk or something, to make it into a more compact ball before she feeds it to the young. So it makes it very difficult to see what it is that they're feeding their young, but we were able to get some information on that. This is a really interesting video taken by one of my field assistants, Kenji. He always got way better footage than I did. And these are two young olive-sided flycatchers that have already fledged. So they've fledged the nest, but they're begging for food from the female, and she's coming to feed them, even though they're independent. They've left the nest, but they're still not very good at acquiring food. So she's feeding them, and you can't hear it, but hopefully you can still get an idea. So she's fed one of them. Anyways, great footage that my field assistant got of that. So from that information, we can kind of get an idea of what these birds are feeding to their young, and then from what's in the traps, we can get an idea of the diversity available, and kind of get an index of biomass, like how much food is available and when that peaks. So these are just a few of those results here showing prey availability. So hundreds of thousands of insects we sorted through, myself and field assistants, to figure out what was available. And in Yukon, it's mostly dipterans, mostly flies. Different types of flies. Some of them are big, some of them are small, like all the different species of mosquito and all the species of black flies and then some of the larger dipterans and things like that. But that's not what was fed. That wasn't what was most commonly fed to young. The olive-sided flycatchers were targeting certain kinds of insects, like dragonflies, even though dragonflies were some of our least common. So shown here in orange, they were some of the least common insects found, but they were fed at 37% frequency, which means they're probably targeting those bigger insects, which was unexpected. We thought they might be targeting something that was more common, like large bees and wasps, the larger dipterans, things like that, which they were also using bees and wasps at about 12%, and then they were using dipterans as well, and some was just unknown. And other species like western wood pewee, they're a little bit of a smaller species, and they were feeding more in accordance with what was available. They were feeding a lot of dipterans, a lot of flies and things to their young. Again, these are videos taken by Kenji, who is way better at taking video than me, showing the female coming in and feeding young. This is an olive-sided flycatcher nest, and this is a western wood pewee nest. It's the female coming in to feed young. And then interestingly here, she takes a fecal sac after she feeds them. So it keeps the nest really, really clean, which probably is, to help defend against predators, keep the nest really clean so that predators aren't drawn in by the scent and things like that. Oops. And we're also finding that timing is changing. So with climate change, breeding is being initiated earlier, but arrival from non-breeding areas isn't, probably because there's constraints on how early they can arrive because they migrate from so far away. There's only so much earlier that they can arrive, and they're also not receiving those cues, environmental cues, that they need to arrive 2 weeks early. So they're arriving at pretty much the same time, but then they're initiating breeding earlier, it seems. We don't have a long time series yet, but it seems that the date that they start incubating is getting earlier with year. So we need to investigate this further and see if this is a long-term trend. The problem with that is that interval between arrival and breeding can only get so small. That time is really crucial. After migrating 10,000 kilometers, it's really crucial to then restore energy, to eat and rebuild those energy reserves before breeding is initiated. And as that interval gets smaller, they don't have time to do that, which is probably why, or one of the reasons, we're seeing a decline in reproductive success with year. So reproductive success over the 5 years of this part of the study actually declined. So that's something we need to investigate further. So they're breeding earlier, but their success is lower. So those are things that require further investigation. So I'll be doing more work on that. Insect abundance may also be declining with years. This also really needs further investigation. So I only have 5 years of data on this, but there's something going on with insect abundance, and that it fluctuates hugely from year to year, and it seems to be declining, at least since 2014. 15, 16, 17, it seems to be this decline in the gray bars with year of insect abundance, which might be related to increasing spring temperatures. So that, that winter and spring is when temperatures are really changing with climate change, and it's getting hotter and drier in the spring. So there's fewer insects available. So this also warrants further investigation, though. Is this a long-term trend, or is this just a weird anomaly we've seen for a couple of years? And then don't worry about all the details on this, just to show you an example of how I'm trying to build models, or I did build models to try to describe this asynchrony. Like, are the birds and the insects still timed appropriately? And we can actually apply models to this to see, just to assign values to this, try to quantify it. And it does work. There's a lot of noise in the data, of course. With insects, there's always noise in the data, but it does work. We can actually predict breeding timing and progression based on insect abundance. So the vertical lines, the dotted lines, just show the difference in timing between bird peak breeding energy needs and insects. So that's what this shows here. The birds are in blue, the insects are in red. So you can see in 2015, 16, and 17, the insect abundance was much lower and weird. And if there was a peak, it was quite early. And the bird peak is kind of the same as always, around right at the end of June, first week of July. That's when peak, breeding energetic demands are, when they're feeding their young and they need lots of energy. Doesn't change that much, but the insect abundance does fluctuate in timing quite a bit. But it seems like 2015, 16, 17, the birds were kind of late. So this also warrants further investigation. Is this a long-term trend, or was it just 2015, 16, and 17 were bad years for the birds? It does suggest that there's a trend occurring, but again, we need to investigate that more. So timing is important. We know that for sure. Birds are the most successful in breeding if they're not particularly late or early. So if they're intermediate, not too early, not too late. If they're too early, the first nest often fails and they have to re-nest, which then their peak energy needs are much later. So timing is certainly important, but it's not a perfectly clear picture, like it never is in biology. This is Cheyenne, a student who's sorting through 10,000 insects over a winter. So kudos to her. It's a lot of work. So overall, these are some of the things we've been finding out. Insect abundance can be used to predict, timing of bird breeding scores. So that's just a measure of, when it occurs. Breeding success is very strange, though. Breeding success may be declining with year, possibly because it's occurring earlier. Insect abundance, there's a lot of noise in the data, but probably because there's a lot of diversity in the north. We have a lot of species of flies and bees and wasp relatives, and even dragonflies. There's a lot of different species. So there's a lot of noise in the data, making it a little bit harder to examine these patterns. Whereas other parts of the world, they've got a lower insect diversity, so it's easier to model these relationships between predator and prey. We're also finding, back to habitat, how important water bodies are. So these small water bodies, ponds and wetlands and creeks in the boreal forest are absolutely essential to support breeding of birds, because almost all birds that breed in the boreal forest feed their young insects. So that insect abundance is so important, not just for these aerial insectivores, but for many species of birds. So next steps, things that students can get involved in. So some of these I've shed a little bit of light on, some of these factors contributing to declines of these species of bird. I want to investigate, toxins and pesticides further, even though, we don't have widespread pesticide application programs in the north, our birds are passing through areas that do. So that needs further investigation. Also, just looking at persistence of water bodies with climate change and also land use. And then, shedding more light on migratory patterns and connectivity. So those are things that, I'll be continuing on with. We've got a project going right now utilizing information from ARUs, or automatic recording devices, in partnership with Environment and Climate Change Canada, just to see if we can get some of this same information and even more detailed information about daily behavioral patterns and territory use, occupancy from year to year. That's difficult to do in the field because you need, a lot of field hours. So this can replace some of the field hours, just putting up these automatic recording units, and they're set to record for, 20 minutes every hour over a 24-hour period. So you can get a lot of information. And then I have always in the background have this side project going, because I also have this interest in songs and singing behavior and the functions of songs and how birds communicate and sexual selection. So that's another thing that, is kind of, someone wants to get involved in that, have that kind of going in the background all the time. And then tracking migration, I had done a trial study using light level geolocators on a couple birds. And now I would like to expand that and come up with, we had sort of limited success. We collaborated with Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and they got some pretty good information from geolocators. But I would like to come up with data to augment that, or a better way to track where our birds are going. So that will be, a next step. So thanks, that's all I want to say. So lots of people are involved. A lot of these projects are very collaborative. So U of A, Yukon Research Center, those collaborative data projects. So the BAM team, and help with modeling techniques and things like that. And field assistance and other things. So, okay, thanks. That's all I want to say.
That was great, Tara. Thank you. I learned a lot.
Good.
So this next part that we have here is open for questions. If people have questions, if you missed part of the presentation and you'd like a copy of the lecture, or would just like to reach out to get more information on our science programs or how you can get involved, the contact information is in the chat box now. So we'll open it up to you, or actually before I do, I'm going to do a really quick poll of everybody. It is anonymous. I'm just curious how people found out about today's presentation. So if you wouldn't mind just selecting all that apply. Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Does anyone have any questions for Tara or I? No. All right. Well, as I said, if you do think of questions after the fact, feel free to send us an email or reach out, and we'll get back to you with those answers. Thanks for joining us today, and a big thank you to Tara for providing all that information. That was fantastic.
No problem. Thanks, Jen.
Have a great day, everyone.